This is it, Apokolips. Now. Hey Parademons, I'm the Comics Kid 2099 and I'm here to discuss the two-part Superman the Animated Series episode Apokolips Now. If you haven't seen the episode, I strongly encourage you to watch it before you go much further in this video because there are some spoilers ahead. We see that Bruno Mannheim is once again back on Earth in command of Intergang and has used some fancy technology to rob a bank, much to Darkseid's dismay. Darkseid only wants Mannheim on Earth to help plant a bomb that will drill a hole of fire to the center of the Earth and then turn Earth into a second apocalypse. Superman is able to prevent this, but it's a momentary victory because Darkseid and Steppenwolf bring an army of parademons to just take the planet themselves. Although Superman gets his butt handed to him, Orion, Darkseid's son raised by his enemy Highfather, comes in with reinforcements to tell Darkseid to get off Earth, and he does, right after he murders Dan Turpin. We end with a touching funeral with Superman saying the world just needed a brave man and not necessarily a Superman. I wouldn't be blowing anyone's mind when I say that this two-parter was a game changer for this series. Heck, not just this series, but American animation in general. I am not an expert on all of American animation, but I'm having trouble thinking of another series that killed off supporting characters of equal import as Dan Turpin before this episode did. So just for that, this episode is a bit of a milestone. But mostly, it just seemed like the creators of this series were getting, I don't know if bored is the right word, but they definitely wanted to shake things up. This episode is the culmination of roughly a year of subplots here and there, and it raises the stakes higher than any other episode of this series so far. Then, looking past this episode for a moment, we have the introduction of Supergirl immediately after this, which is a status quo change that later episodes would have a very hard time ignoring, and then following that, we have several team-up stories with the likes of Batman, Green Lantern, and Aquaman. It almost seems like the solo Superman adventure status quo was permanently put to rest in this episode. If you listen to the commentary for part 2 on the DVD box set, one of the guys, might have been Dan Reba, I can't remember, even said that while he liked the series up to this point, nothing had really happened yet, and that's why this episode is so momentous. And that is very telling because I had very much the same reaction to the first half of the DCAU when I first started doing these reviews a few years ago. While I did remember watching Batman the Animated Series, Batman Beyond, and to a lesser extent, Superman the Animated Series as a child, I didn't watch every single episode, and I watched episodes out of order. My real initiation into the DCAU came with Justice League, and by the time you got to JLU, I was a rabid fan, and I would not allow myself to miss episodes. I'd spend a week, sometimes weeks if there were hiati, thinking about what was coming next, and there was a real interconnected feeling of all of those episodes. But that's not really how it was done in the pre-Justice League DCAU shows. There's some great episodes, don't get me wrong, but if you're looking for tight continuity and long-running subplots episode to episode, much like I was when I first started reviewing Batman the Animated Series, then you're going to be disappointed. Which brings us back to Superman the Animated Series, and one of the creators saying that not a lot happened yet in this series. I found that statement a little weird because by now, I'm used to there not being much continuity. That's just how cartoons were in the 1990s. Heck, this episode gives us what feels like the third time Bruno Mannheim has met his doom in the series, so continuity is most definitely out the window. But I'm not complaining. Even if this series isn't as tightly woven as JLU would later be, even after this episode does deliver on the stakes like none other before, and arguably none other after, although I do think Legacy could be a tie with this episode. Heck, with everything we have going on in these 2 half-hour chunks, I wish this had been a 3 or 4-parter instead of just 2 parts. I know we've only had 2 3-parters in the series so far, and we haven't had any stories longer than that in this series. But when you look at everything this story wants to do, I can't help but feel that 2 episodes just isn't enough space to do all of that. I would have liked to have seen more of the city under siege by aliens, and then we could see people like Perry White, Dan Turpin, and Lois Lane helping people get to secret underground safe houses or something like that. Heck, we could see what Luthor's reaction to all of this would be. We see him staring daggers at his TV when Darkseid announces that he will be taking over the world, and we see him at Dan Turpin's funeral, but that's it. This would have been a golden opportunity to show that Lex does have a little humanity in him. He's opportunistic, he's greedy, and he would probably sell his mother's own soul for a chance to kill Superman. But that doesn't mean that he wants to see his planet fall into the hands of an alien warlord. So this would have been a great place to show Luthor allying with Superman and friends. Of course, the Fourth World stuff is all very black and white, with characters either being 100% good or 100% evil. So maybe that would have been a little difficult to pull off while also introducing these characters we haven't seen before in this series. And if this had been a 3 or 4-parter, then we could have done a lot more with the Fourth World characters here. This is a fine line to walk because this is Superman's show, so you don't want him to get lost in the shuffle of introducing characters that it took Jack Kirby 4 simultaneous comic books to introduce. But at the same time, this episode is supposed to introduce this intergalactic war between gods and their civilizations, so these very gods should feel like they have some weight in this story, right? And other than Darkseid, none of them really do. Let's look at them one by one. You get Orion, who shows up in part 1, and he comes to warn Superman that Darkseid is coming. coming, because even though Superman very briefly met Darkseid in the episode Father's Day, he has no reason to suspect that Darkseid is connected to Intergang or the spaceship that the MCPD confiscated. So once Orion arrives, all he does is sum up the concept of the fourth world to Superman and any audience members who have no idea who these clowns are. Then we find out there's some flying space tanks, and Orion helps Superman fight those things. But that's all just there to kill time until the end of the episode, and it doesn't actually have any weight or meaning. Succeed or fail, it doesn't matter because Darkseid and Mannheim still managed to blow up an island, and all Orion really did was punch some guys who were very good at distracting our heroes. Then he gives Superman a means to contact him because, as he says, Superman will need help fighting Darkseid. But then immediately in part 2, that contact device is broken, so Superman can't contact Orion anyway. But Orion does come back at the end of the episode, and this bugged me a little bit. He tells Darkseid that Highfather now considers Earth part of his protection, and any further aggression will effectively render their treaty null and void. Okay, cool. But then Darkseid does do some further aggression. He kills Dan Turpin, right in front of everybody. Orion sees it happen, and he tells Superman, "I'm sorry. But are you, dude? You didn't go and report this to Highfather, did you? And if you did, Highfather clearly doesn't care because we see no evidence that New Genesis goes to war with Darkseid after this." And I get it. We need an army of New Genesis to arrive so we can get Darkseid off the planet. But we also need to have an emotional death that sticks, which was the whole reason for doing this episode in the first place. So we have to kind of combine those elements, and unfortunately, it just doesn't work here. But maybe it could have if this had been a longer story. We could have actually given the gods of New Genesis more to do other than show up and literally do nothing in the second part and nothing important in the first part. So then we have Steppenwolf, who arrives with Darkseid to attack the planet after the explosion at the island. And remember when the Justice League movie came out and everyone was complaining that Steppenwolf was boring and had no real personality? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Steppenwolf. That's him, guys. He's boring and he doesn't have a lot of personality. In all honesty, we could have very easily removed him from this episode and you wouldn't even notice. Darkseid could have come to this planet with an army of parademons and it would have been fine. It's one thing if Steppenwolf shows up later and has a big arc and this is just his introduction, but I don't even remember if he does show up again in a DCAU. So if he does show up again, it's not a very important return. After that, we basically have the rest of the Fourth World characters. Some of them, like Highfather and Granny Goodness, they show up in flashbacks but don't actually have any bearing on the story in the present day. Some, like Barda and Mr. Miracle, show up but have no lines and absolutely no bearing on the story at hand. And you might say that the core of this story didn't need those characters, that at its core, this is the story of a normal guy who stands up to evil and dies, and the effect that it has on someone even as powerful as Superman. And that is what this story is about. But again, the Fourth World is crucial to that story, and so much of the Fourth World gets shoved aside in this story, which seems counterintuitive. All I'm saying is, I think the core of this story could have remained intact, while also inflating the importance of some of these other characters here. The only real Fourth World character who gets to shine here is Darkseid, and I'm torn because I like Darkseid. He's menacing, he has a sort of charisma even though you know he's very evil, and his presence feels weighty in equal parts to the story. But on the other hand, a problem I've always had with Darkseid is that he's just evil. His motivations are very vague and undefined. He wants the anti-life equation. Okay, but what is that? Does he just want to kill everyone? Why? To what end? And his whole obsession with the anti-life equation is barely even touched on here. It's mentioned in Orion's little PowerPoint presentation, but then what does turning Earth into a second Apokolips do to help Darkseid find the anti-life equation? As near as I can tell, it's completely unrelated. He just wants to do this because he's generically evil. Don't get me wrong, he's still one of my favorite baddies, but there's not much to his character. So much of what makes him entertaining is 1, Michael Ironside's performance, and 2, all the stuff that I mentioned earlier. He's menacing, his charisma, all that stuff. But his motivations are basically non-existent, and motivations are very important in shaping a character, and character is very important in shaping a conflict, and conflict is very important in a story. So there is quite a bit of good stuff going on in this episode. In the commentary, Bruce Timm mentioned the very New Testament Satan tempting Jesus thing going on with Darkseid offering Superman a spot on his team. And once he mentions it, it's very obvious, but also I love it very much. Bruce Timm mentions that Kirby tended to go more Old Testament in his stuff, which I see some New Testament stuff in Kirby, like Silver Surfer being a less altruistic version of John the Baptist as a herald of a new entity on the rise. But as far as the Fourth World stuff, Tim felt this was a little out of place, but I think it works great. But even with that stuff working beautifully, even better than a lot of the Fourth World stuff of the comics I would dare to say, this episode is still not quite up to snuff thanks to the slapdash characterization of Darkseid. And maybe it's not the fault of the people working on this show. Maybe they're just bringing the character from the comics to the screen. I would say that's true. I have the same problems with Darkseid in the comics as I do in this episode. But they are still problems, and they don't just go away just because this is bringing in those problems from one one medium to another. So I think that's all I have to say about this episode. I could probably find some more to talk about, but really, I've talked almost 3 times as much here as I usually do about these episodes, so I think that's good for now. I hope you guys liked this episode and this review, and if you did, I do reviews every Saturday, so check in next week, and I'll be talking about the 2-part Superman the Animated Series episode, Little Girl Lost. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.